Here's your wrestling news for October 2nd, 2020. And your headlines for today include: WWE plans to take over Twitch accounts and revenue from its wrestlers. Wrestlers already taking action. Kevin Owens returning to SmackDown. Alexa Bliss set to explain her connection with The Fiend on SmackDown this week. WWE makes monumental announcement about Roman Reigns for SmackDown. Vince McMahon's bizarre original plan for Rusev in WWE revealed. Thank God the angle was scrapped. Wrestler hit by a car while riding a bicycle, suffers several injuries. The Rock confirms when the XFL will return. Sami Zayn talks about why he is prohibited from entering Saudi Arabia. Lars Sullivan's name is coming up a lot in WWE creative meetings, and more. We are starting off with some big news from WWE as more details have come out about the company's new edict against third-party deals. Wrestling Inc. is reporting that in 4 weeks, WWE will assume control of every wrestler's Twitch account, as well as the revenue that is earned by these third-party deals, and that the superstars will receive a percentage of the money they earn on these accounts. On the surface, this report sounds like a terrible outcome for the wrestlers in WWE, who are unfairly classified as independent contractors, yet subject to rules similar to contracted employees, but without any benefits. Not only that, but WWE's attempt to micromanage and control the amount of money the wrestlers can make through Twitch is a ruthless maneuver rooted in greed, and we hope other companies don't follow suit. A few superstars are already closing down their accounts, as Roderick Strong has let fans know that he's shutting down his Cameo account, and NXT's Scarlett has also left the platform, setting her price at $1,000, but adding that the account is inactive until further notice. NXT's Emily Anzulis has taken a different approach, changing her Cameo name to 1288594 and setting no profile picture, though it's unclear if she'll still be taking requests. Some other superstars don't have profile photos anymore, but their accounts seem to be active, and Cameo isn't the only site to lose out. Johnny Gargano and Candice LeRae held off as long as they could, but they've shut down their PWT's account, with the designs on the store not being licensed by WWE. Fans had until midnight yesterday to get their last shirts from the happy couple, and whilst Twitch users will seemingly be allowed to continue on the streaming platform, they'll have to get permission, use their legal names, and accept that the company will take a large cut of their earnings. Some Cameo accounts appear to be active, albeit without the superstar's profile photo, but given the situation, we'll have to see how many are left after October 3rd. Over to SmackDown now, as Alexa Bliss has a strange connection to The Fiend, with her hitting Sister Abigail and losing her mind whenever he is mentioned. Lacey Evans suffered Bliss's possessed wrath firsthand when she mentioned The Fiend on SmackDown, being laid out by the Goddess, who appeared to be in a trance. And when Booker T mentioned The Fiend in a podcast with Bliss, she once again froze on the spot. Now fans will get to hear what Bliss has to say, as she'll be the guest on tonight's edition of The Kevin Owens Show, which will be part of the brand-to-brand invitational that WWE didn't use until Shinsuke Nakamura and Cesaro recently showed up on Raw. WWE promoted tonight's segment with Bliss, saying that nobody knows what kind of hold The Fiend has over her, and hopefully we'll get some answers tonight with Kevin Owens asking the questions. Speaking of SmackDown, tonight's show will see a huge title match take place mere days after Clash of Champions. At the pay-per-view, Sami Zayn was crowned the undisputed Intercontinental Champion in a triple threat ladder match against AJ Styles and Jeff Hardy, but will now defend his title against Hardy in singles action. Zayn recently commented that the ladder match was his favorite match in the past 3 or 4 years, and we'll have to see if his winning ways continue tonight when he faces the former champion. More from SmackDown now, and after a successful title defense at Clash of Champions, Roman Reigns will have plenty to say tonight. In the aftermath of last Sunday's win, WWE has confirmed a monumental segment tonight, as Reigns will officially be crowned as the Tribal Chief. The ceremony will be presided over by Paul Heyman, and it'll be interesting to hear what the Big Dog has to say after his match and the aftermath last Sunday. Reigns' match with Jey Uso only ended with the return of Jimmy Uso, who threw in the towel for his beaten and bruised brother, and also referred to Reigns as the Tribal Chief to stop him from beating down on Jey. Destroying his family, and with a ceremony awaiting him tonight, Reigns' heel turn is finally complete, and it'll be interesting to see where Reigns' character goes next as the head of the table, especially with a potential Roman vs. Fiend feud down the line. Now, it's no secret that WWE has a lot of ideas that don't see the light of day, such as the time Vince McMahon wanted to reveal himself as the father of his daughter Stephanie's child. This week, AEW's Miro revealed that he nearly suffered from a terrible idea too, which he argues would have totally killed the Rusev character. Speaking to AEW Unrestricted, the Bulgarian spoke about his final angle in WWE, including a segment where Lana said he was a sex addict, but the originally pitched plan was for Rusev to have erectile dysfunction. He added, "They really wanted to kill me completely. There's nothing wrong with people who have erectile dysfunction, people take care of it, but that was not the case here. There was no coming back from it. Absolutely no coming back from it. I told them, Vince, this is going to bury me completely." Miro argued that the sex addict idea was better, and the company thankfully agreed, and though nothing came of that revelation either, it's far better than erectile dysfunction. Instead of struggling to get it up, Rusev struggled to get on TV, as he sat home for months before his release on April 15th, and that wasn't all the former US champion had to say. In a separate interview with Chris Van Vliet, Miro added that WWE didn't like his partnership with Aiden English and would refuse to highlight any of the Maestro of Mayhem's very real skills. It doesn't make much sense that WWE didn't want a superstar getting over, but after blocking English from doing a suicide dive or a baseball slide, the company clearly didn't want anything that made English look good. Now, both men are gone from WWE, and Miro is the best man of AEW, and we doubt he'll have to go through any of this hokey booking in Tony Khan's promotion. Over to Impact Wrestling now, as some of WWE's April 15th releases have made it to their company, though Joe Hennig, aka Curtis Axel, isn't one of them. That's an issue for Heath Slater, who spoke to TV Insider recently and revealed that a number of superstars have contacted him about joining Impact, saying that the company looks fun, but they're locked into WWE contracts. The one-man band specifically name-dropped Hennig in the conversation, saying, "I would like to see Joe Hennig over here, Mr. Perfect Son. I would like to see him come over to Impact. I've talked to him, but he's doing his thing right now and enjoying life. I don't blame him. Do you, buddy? He's one of my best friends and a hell of a worker." In WWE, Axel never reached the same heights as his father did many years ago, and whilst he's earned a break from the ring after so many years with WWE, it seems there's plenty of interest in the former Intercontinental Champion from Impact Wrestling. Over to AEW next, and CIMA hasn't been around for a while, and for a very unfortunate reason. On Twitter, the Japanese star revealed that he was in a traffic accident whilst riding his bicycle, and has a laundry list of injuries, including facial contusion, nasal fracture, left wrist joint contusion, right hand contusion, neck contusion, and lumbar contusion, and added that he has an unspecific head injury in the translated tweet. We here at Slat Rock Wrestling would like to send our best wishes to CIMA, as this was the last thing he wanted in 2020, and at least he seems to be in good spirits as he aims for a big comeback. From the ring to the gridiron next, as The Rock and his partners bought the XFL after Vince McMahon couldn't make it work twice, and now we have a date for when fans can see the Brahma Bulls' vision of football. On Twitter, The Rock confirmed that the new league will start in spring 2022 after the initial hope of a 2021 return was a bit premature. Describing the new league as an uphill battle, Rock added that the team behind it are hungry, humble, and nobody will outwork them. The Rock does have a track record of big successes, though to be fair, so does Vince McMahon. And whilst the ongoing global situation was the deciding factor in Vince's 2020 league shutting down, hopefully The Rock will make a success of it in 2 years' time. Now, the WWE is in the early years of a decade-long deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which will bring hundreds of millions to Vince's company. Since the first show in 2018, the Saudi deal has been mired in controversy, with fans highlighting the country's unfair treatment of women and the WWE's continuation with their deal, despite the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, reportedly approved by the Saudi royal family. One person who's never made any Saudi shows is Sami Zayn, whose background as a proud Syrian Canadian have led WWE to keep him at home. And when appearing on the Blind Boy podcast, Zayn was asked if he's banned from Saudi Arabia. He replied, "I don't know the specifics on this. To this day, I didn't really ask because I wasn't really keen on going anyway. but WWE signed some sort of deal to put on these shows in Saudi Arabia for 10 years or something like that, and I just wasn't invited to go. Sami dug deeper into the moral and ethical issues that have come from WWE's deal with Saudi Arabia, adding, "It became very easy to say, well, you shouldn't go to this country because they do these awful things. This is one of the biggest things that I personally deal with, and I feel like I have a lot of weird personal guilt, because I feel like I'm part of the system that I criticize." Though Sami isn't appearing in Saudi Arabia, fans can see him on SmackDown as the undisputed Intercontinental Champion, and given how much his character likes to flap his gums, we wouldn't be surprised if fans could still hear him in Jeddah and Riyadh. Now, it's been over a year since fans saw Lars Sullivan in the ring due to a knee injury, and whilst he's not been on TV, the Freak has been making plenty of headlines. From his controversial comments both before and after signing, which resulted in a $100,000 fine, to his past adult film career, we previously reported that Sullivan's name had been dropped backstage, but now that's apparently changed. Ringside News are reporting that Sullivan's name has been coming up a lot in recent creative meetings, and that WWE have paid attention to his Instagram workout videos, where his impressive vertical leap shows his knee injury is all healed. With the WWE Draft coming up next week, it's possible that Sullivan could return to Raw or SmackDown then, but given his past comments, and the fact that the WWE Universe doesn't forget, his return could still be difficult to pull off. Time will tell whether Sullivan returns next week or returns to WWE TV at all, but for now, we know that his name has been coming up backstage. And we're ending with news from AEW, and although the company teased a Four Horsemen faction for quite some time, they need to secure the name to make it happen. Now, Arn Anderson is doing just that, as recent filings have revealed that Anderson applied for a trademark on the Horseman name earlier this week, using AEW's usual trademark attorney, Michael Dockings. There's no shortage of horsemen in AEW, as the company has both Double A and Tully Blanchard on board, and it's been previously rumored that this generation's horsemen would be Cody Rhodes, Shawn Spears, and FTR. Of course, this all hinges on AEW getting the Horseman trademark, which will be difficult to say the least, and fans can expect WWE to put up quite a fight to make sure the Horseman name is never used in their competition.